Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck tech for you from the new Phyrexia Obi-Wan set, and we're going to be doing something a little bit different this time. So today we're going to be doing a regular deck tech, but we're also going to include some budget alternatives, and if you do the budget deck list, the deck is going to come in at under $75, which is awesome, I think. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy these videos. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me, and we're currently growing the channel and it helps me a lot. Much appreciated. And today we're doing a brand new deck tech from the new set, Phyrexia Obi-Wan, and the commander we've chosen is Unctus Grand Metatect. So anyway, if you don't know what Unctus Grand Metatect does, he is a 1 colorless, 2 blue, legendary artifact creature Phyrexian Vidalcan. It's a 2/4. Other blue creatures you control have whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, then discard a card. Other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1, and Phyrexian blue, until end of turn, target creature you control becomes a blue artifact in addition to its other colors and types. Activate only as a sorcery. So this card is being discussed as a CEDH commander with the combo with a Feto Alchemist and a couple of other cards, which all mean it can go infinite very easily to draw your entire deck and then win with Thassa's Oracle. But that's not really the way I like to play commanders, so I focus instead of making this into an aggro list and a list that's going to build around all the drawing and discarding, which is going to allow us to fuel our graveyard and dig through our deck pretty quickly, and then have all these cool little synergies and cool underappreciated cards that are suddenly going to become much better in this deck. There is also an artifact sub-theme, because obviously this is going to pump all of your artifacts, so we've looked for creatures that are both artifacts and blue if possible. I'm really excited about this list because it looks super fun to play and I can't wait to put it together. So without further ado, let's get started, and we're starting off with Alandra, Sky Dreamer. This is a perfect fit for this deck because we're almost always going to be drawing 2 cards a turn with this early, which is then going to give us some Drakes. After we have a few Drakes out, then we suddenly drawing 5 cards a turn with Unctus, at which point all of our Drakes are going to get a huge buff, and this should finish the game pretty quickly. This is a perfect fit for the deck because it's going to make extra blue creatures which are going to loot when they attack. All-Seeing Arbiter is an underappreciated card from New Capenna. Usually it's not very good, but in this deck it's going to be amazing. So to start off, whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, it's going to draw 2 cards, then discard a card. Of course, if you have Unctus in play, when it attacks, it's going to draw an extra card and discard an extra card. And every time you discard a card with anything, not just with this creature, you're going to be giving a creature an opponent controls -X -0, where X is the number of different mana values among cards in your graveyard. In this deck, we're discarding so much that you're probably going to have 5 or 6 different mana values fairly easily, and at that point you're giving multiple creatures -X attack until your next turn, which means you can't really be hit on the crackback. This is a must kill in this deck because it's going to make all your opponent's creatures completely useless while it's on board. Chasm Skulker fits perfectly here because we're going to be drawing so many cards that it's going to get a bunch of counters on it, and then when it dies we're going to get a bunch of blue creatures which are going to draw us more cards. Just fantastic. Cloudfin Raptor is a nice little early drop that's going to grow quite a bit throughout the game. It's just one of the ways we can start aggroing our opponents and dealing damage early. Containment Construct fits really well in a deck that's going to be looting this much. We can basically exile a few of the cards we loot every turn. If we think there's a chance, we're going to play them. Covert Technician is an artifact creature and it's blue, which fits both of the requirements for Unctus, and it has a couple of relevant abilities. One of them is Ninjutsu, which can rebuy another ETB creature or just return a small creature to our hand. But then also, if it manages to deal combat damage to a player, then you're going to be able to put an artifact card with mana value less than or equal to its power from your hand onto the battlefield. Seeing as Unctus is going to pump this to a 3/5, that means that most of the artifacts in our deck are going to be able to put in with Covert Technician. Cunning Survivor is another perfect fit in this deck. So normally it's a very unimpressive 1/3, but whenever you cycle or discard a card, it's going to get +1/+0 and be unable to be blocked until end of turn. Every blue creature we attack with in this deck, which is most of the creatures in the deck, is going to give this +1/+0, and it's going to be unblockable. So this can be swinging for like 6-8 unblockable damage mid-game. It's insane. Dulcet Sirens is really nice in this deck because we want creatures with activated abilities so that we can loot during our opponent's turn, and this is a really good one because it forces one of our opponent's creatures to attack another one of our opponents. We control who it attacks. It allows for lots of politics, and it's also going to draw us and discard a card with Unctus. Emery Lurker of the Log fits this deck like a glove. It's going to cost 1 less for each artifact we control. We're running a ton of artifacts, so this should be very cheap. When it comes into play, we're going to mill, which, as you will see later on, is going to be quite useful in this deck, and then we can replay an artifact each turn from our graveyard, and since we're looting so much, we're probably going to be dumping a lot of artifacts in there. It's just amazing in this deck. deck. Esperzoa is a classic old card that I loved from my Shards of Alara days. It's just a nice beefy body that's going to be able to get through while still looting. With Unctus out, this is a 5/4 flyer, which is very respectable, that's also going to loot whenever it attacks. And then it'll also allow us to return some artifacts to our hand, which can sometimes be good because we can rebuy enter the battlefield abilities. Ethereum Sculptor is a classic in any artifact deck. We have 21 artifacts in this deck, so it's going to be giving a sizable discount to a lot of our stuff. Expendable Lackey is a pretty spicy 1-drop. It's a 1/1 that's going to get in early and loot with Unctus, and then when it dies, we can exile it from a graveyard to get a 1/1 unblockable that can loot every time it attacks. It's also great to loot away with other cards because we can just exile it from the graveyard for value. Fairy Vandal is going to get a counter every single one of our turns just by itself, but if we have any of our creatures that can tap during opponents' turns out, it can grow to ridiculous sizes. Ghostly Pilfer is just a good early beater that can become unblockable, which is great in this deck, and it's also going to draw some cards when people do stuff like play their commanders. Glasspool Mimic is great as a land that also doubles up as a decent creature. Invisible Stalker is just a 1/1 in this deck, but it's a 1/1 that can loot consistently, which is very nice. Jace Vryn's Prodigy is going to be really good because thanks to Unctus, every time we tap it, we're going to be drawing 2 and discarding 2. I don't know about you, but getting a Faithless looting for free every turn seems pretty good to me. It's also ludicrously easy to flip it, and then once it's flipped, we can start rebuying stuff from our graveyard, or we can just make our opponent's creatures less effective. Very solid card overall. Kappa Cannoneer used to be very expensive, but it's gone down a lot in price, and it's still an excellent card in this deck. So we can tap artifacts in order to play it for cheaper, and a really cool thing about this is that if we make our artifacts blue with Unctus, or if they're already blue, like quite a few of them are, then they're also going to loot when we tap to improvise, which is amazing. It has Ward 4, which might as well be hexproof most of the time, and then whenever any other artifact comes into play, it's going to get a +1/+1 counter on it and be unable to be blocked, so this is a great way to finish out games. Ledger Shredder is obviously an amazing card. We're going to be playing multiple things a turn in this deck, very likely since all of our stuff is so low on mana, and then our opponents are going to do that too. Obviously we want to be looting and we want to be attacking with small blue creatures, so this fits very well. However, it is not the most essential card in the deck, and if you are looking to go budget, this is one of the cards that I would cut, and I would put in Merfolk Pupil from the new Jumpstart. It's really good because it's going to loot once when it comes into play, it's going to loot every time it attacks, and then we can exile it from the graveyard to loot again. So that's going to give us a fantastic amount of value, and it's also going to be a great card to discard with any of our other effects because we can just exile it from the graveyard to loot. Next up we have Master of Ethereum, another great card from Shards of Alara. It's going to have power and toughness equal to the artifacts you control. We have a lot of those. And then other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1, so it's going to buff up the rest of our artifacts. Just very good overall. Master of Waves is great in any devotion deck, and we are running quite a lot of blue pips in this deck, so it's going to make a bunch of 2/1s, and they are blue elementals, so whenever they tap, we're going to be looting. Min Wily Illusionist is a great card that I've been wanting to include in decks for a while, and it fits so perfectly here. So it's going to trigger every single turn with just Unctus out, but then again, we can trigger during our opponent's turns with some of our tap creatures. That means that we're going to be getting at least 1 illusion per turn cycle, and those illusions also loot when they attack, which is fantastic. And then when the illusions die, they're going to allow us to put permanents from our hand onto the battlefield. That's just insane. Mistcloaked Herald is very straightforward, just a 1-drop that can attack constantly and loot. Nadir Kraken is going to work so well with Unctus because every time we draw a card, we can pay 1 mana and get another 1/1 blue creature token that can then do the same the next turn, loot us more cards. Network Disruptor is a great little nifty 1-drop that happens to be an artifact as well, so it becomes a 2/2 with Unctus, and it's also going to enable some attacks. If you draw it mid-game, you can tap down one of our opponent's things. It's a great thing to bounce back to hand with Esperzoa as well, because we can keep recasting it. Psychosis Trawler is one of the ways for us to finish the game. If we drop this with a decent board in play, we can shoot our opponents for an absolutely obnoxious amount of damage with all the looting we're doing. Research Thief is going to allow all of our creatures to draw a card when they deal combat damage to a player, so it's just another way to get more cards in the deck because we didn't have enough. Reservoir Kraken is a card I really like from Streets of New Capenna, and it hasn't seen any play yet, which I'm sad about, but it fits so perfectly in this deck. It has Trample and Ward 2, and then at the beginning of combat, one of our opponents can tap one of their creatures to tap the Reservoir Kraken. If they do, we get a 1/1 blue fish that can't be blocked. So no matter what they do, we're going to get something good here. If they tap the Kraken, we're going to loot because the Kraken got tapped, and then we're going to get a 1/1 unblockable that can loot more in the future. If they don't tap the Kraken, we're hitting for a 6/6 trample, and we're still looting because it's still tapped. So they're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't. Sharding Sphinx is fantastic in this deck with all the artifact creatures we have, and we can also make our normal creatures artifacts if we want with Unctus as well, which is nice. Crucially as well, the tokens that Sharding Sphinx makes are blue and artifacts, so they're basically 2/2 flies that loot. That seems insane. Siren Storm Tamer is a nice evasive 1-drop that's also going to give a bit of protection to one of our things. Scab Ruinator is another card that is very maligned and people think are really bad, but in this deck it is absolutely insane. We have so many creatures and our graveyard is going to be so stocked that we should be able to cast this a few times per game, and it's just a 5/6 flyer for 3 mana that's going to loot when it attacks. That's insane. Skyway Robber is a card I really like in this deck. Since our graveyard is going to be so full, we're going to be able to activate the escape late game if this gets killed or if we mill it into our graveyard naturally. And when it escapes, we're going to be able to play an artifact, instant, or sorcery from the cards exiled with it for free if it deals combat damage. So just a lot of upside and a very recursive threat in this deck. Slitherblade is another evasive 1-drop. Soul of New Phyrexia is great to give protection to our board, and it's fantastic because we can also mill it into the graveyard, and then someone might forget about it and cast a board wipe, and we can just exile it to give all of our permanents indestructible until end of turn for a massive blowout. Spinethopter is a decent evasive creature that can come down for 2 mana. It's also an artifact and blue, which are both relevant in this deck. Surge Engine is another card that hasn't been seeing much love from the Brothers War, but it's fantastic in this deck because it can't be blocked as long as you sink just 1 mana into it. And if we sink 3 more mana into it, it becomes blue and a 5/4. So it's going to be very easy to get in for damage with this. And being an artifact creature and blue are both very good. Tetsuko Umezawa Fugitive is going to give unblockable to a large percentage of creatures in our deck. Thieving Skydiver is just a good card in most Commander games. You're going to be able to steal a decent artifact from your opponent, even a Soul Ring if you play this on turn 3, which can be absolutely backbreaking. And it also happens to have flying and be blue, so those are both relevant. Thopter Mechanic is going to fit perfectly in this deck. We're going to be drawing 2 cards a turn, so it's going to keep growing and growing, and then when it dies, we still get a nice little artifact creature with flying. Very nice. Thought Monitor is going to come down for very cheap and draws 2 cards, and then it's going to loot whenever it attacks, and it's also going to get +1/+1. Thousand Face Shadow can work so well with many of the cards in the deck, such as Thought Monitor, for example. The fact that we can just put it into play and make a copy of something and get the ETB from that is really, really amazing. Toothy Imaginary Friend is going to grow to ridiculous sizes, and it's basically a must answer immediately for our opponent. If you just have a normal board progression of turn 1 play something, turn 2 play something, turn 3 Unctus, and then you play Toothy before attacks on turn 4, it immediately becomes a 4/4 after attacks. That's absolutely ridiculous, and even if they remove it, you're going to draw 4 cards, and that's not a very unlikely scenario at all. Tradewind Rider is a very spicy one. It's a very old card, a little bit expensive at 4 mana, but the ability is really good in this deck because it's going to allow us to tap untapped creatures we control to return a permanent to its owner's hand. Now, we do have to tap 3 creatures total, and we want to be able to tap our blue creatures during our opponent's turn, so it's kind of activating our commander. Triton Shorestalker is another unblockable 1-drop. Urza Powerstone Prodigy is really good because his ability can be used during any turn, and we'd have a lot of artifacts which we can be discarding to get Powerstone tokens that can then power out our other artifacts or activated abilities. But not only that, this actually triggers on any discard, not just on his own. So if you discard an artifact with another trigger, say during your opponent's turn by tapping something, or during your attack trigger, you can also get a Powerstone token. Even though it's limited to 1 per turn, that's still really good. Phantos Gargoyle is another card that hasn't seen much love, but it's going to be really great in this deck. So we're basically almost always going to be able to block with it because we should always have 4 cards in hand. We can tap it for free even during our opponent's turn to activate all of our other draw 2 cards a turn triggers, and it's going to allow us to make each player mill. That's going to fuel our graveyard, and it's going to fuel itself. And as soon as we have 7 or more cards in one of our opponent's graveyard, which is fairly likely to happen if we're milling them since they naturally play stuff and creatures naturally die, then this can attack, and when it can attack, it becomes a 6/5 flyer for 2 mana. That's also what it is if you just draw it late game, so it's just very, very good. Vedalken Infiltrator is going to be great in this deck as a 2/3 unblockable that loots every time it attacks. And Wolf Infiltrator is another surprisingly good one because it's a great mana sink for us to have. You don't actually need to attack with this. Late game it might be difficult to attack because opponents are probably going to have something that can block this fairly easily, but it does say that whenever you discard a creature card, you may pay 2, and if you do, you get a 3/2 colorless Eldrazi creature token. We're going to be discarding a ton of cards, and we'll probably have mana to spare late game, and this is a nice little mana sink to start making making 3/2s. For instance, we have an Offer You Can't Refuse, Arcane Denial, and Counterspell. They are all cheap ways to protect our board against unwanted attention. We have Cyclonic Rift, which is obviously one of the best cards in Commander. It's a great way to finish off games by sending your opponents back to the Stone Age. If you are looking to go on a budget, I would substitute this for Spectral Deluge, which instead of costing $38 costs $0.7. But in this deck, it's going to be close enough if all you care about is creatures. It's going to bounce most of your opponent's creatures to their hand and not yours, so it's another great finisher of choice. Dig Through Time is great. Delve cards are really good, of course, since we have so much graveyard fueling going on. This is going to be a great way to find answers or dig through our deck. Jwari Disruption is a nice little land that can also double up as a very, very situational counterspell. Resculpt is going to allow us to deal with an artifact or creature. We have a very limited amount of slots for removal in this deck, so we need something that can hit multiple card types like this. Moving on to enchantments, we have Drake Haven, which is going to be unbelievable in this deck. We're going to be discarding so much that it's very trivial to pay 1 mana and get a 2/2 blue Drake creature token every time we discard, which will then fuel future discard because it's going to loot whenever it attacks. Fantastic. Feywild Visitor is going to work so well with Unctus because we have so many evasive threats that we're likely to get 3 fairy dragon creatures every turn, which are then going to give us more looting. Ominous Seas is obviously amazing in this deck. We're drawing so many cards that we should be able to get an 8/8 Kraken pretty much every turn cycle, which is absolutely incredible. Nefarious Ageless Insight is a card that you can consider cutting if you have something else that you would like to put into the deck, because it's a little bit win more, but it is really good if you get it down early, and then instead of looting, you're getting card advantage every time you draw a card. Wizard class is fine for the first and second mode, but if you manage to dump 5 mana into it, that third mode is going to be absolutely disgusting in this deck, because you're drawing so many cards that your creatures are going to get huge. For sorceries, we have Raven Form, which is another nice removal that can also hit artifacts, and we have Treasure Cruise, which is a great way to draw a bunch of cards, seeing as we're going to have such a full graveyard. For artifacts, we have Bident of Thassa, which is a great way to ensure that we're getting card advantage when our creatures attack, and Diviner's Wand, which is going to be surprisingly good in this deck. Whenever we draw a card, the equipped creature is going to get +1/+1 and flying, so we can put this on a creature that doesn't normally have evasion, and then as soon as all of our creatures attack, it's going to become a huge evasive threat. Additionally, we can actually put it onto wizards for free. We have quite a few wizards in the deck, so that'll come up more often than you might think. And finally, we have Teferi Temporal Pilgrim, which is the absolute perfect fit for this deck. He's going to get loyalty counters like it's nobody's business. With a decent enough board, you can even ultimate this the turn it comes down, which basically is going to put one of your opponents out of the game. But even if you don't get to ultimate immediately, the other 2 modes are all really good. Drawing the card is fine, but what we're mostly interested in is making a 2/2 Blue Spirit token with Vigilance, and whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So that token is going to get absolutely massive after just 1 combat with all of our creatures. This is an insanely good fit for this deck. Finally, we're moving on to our utility lands. We have Academy Ruins, which is okay for recurring artifacts from our graveyard, but it's not essential, and if you wanted to go budget, this could very easily be an island. We have Darksteel's Citadel, which is a nice artifact land to help with our artifact count. Mystic Sanctuary is almost always going to be turned on and can return one of our instants or sorceries to the top of our library, so we can immediately draw it with all of our looters. Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, is obviously one of the best cards in the game if you're in a devotion or monocolor theme, which we are. That being said, it's not absolutely essential. This deck has a very low curve, so you could just substitute it for an island and it will be absolutely fine. Scavenger Grounds is nice for having a little bit of graveyard hate. Do be careful if you want to be using your graveyard, because it will exile your own as well. Seat of the Synod is a nice little artifact land that's going to help with our artifact count. Shelldock Isle is incredibly spicy. I'll be completely honest, I have to play the deck a bit to see if this is likely to be turned on, but I think it is possible to turn it on in this deck, which is absolutely insane. Tectonic Edge is just there to deal with problem lands from our opponents. Treasure Vault is another artifact land, but again, it isn't at all essential in this deck, and it's basically there only for the artifact count, so you can feel free to substitute it for an island. War Room is another way to draw cards if we get stuck, but again, not really essential, and we don't really want to be dumping 3 mana unless we really have to, so you could just put in another island for this. And then finally, we have Gaia Reach Sanitarium, which is a great way to draw during our opponent's turn if we need to, and to discard to trigger all of those effects. So there you have it. That has been our Unctus Grand Metatect deck tech. What do you think about this list? Are you excited as I am to check it out? Are there any things you would change? Any additions that you think I missed? Please let me know in the comments section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!